Hi everyone. This is another lecture on speech acoustics. And so this is chapter 10 in the textbook. This lecture is similar to the other one I did about consonants and vowels, but this one's more about how changing our vocal tract, the shape, size, and constriction points, how it creates acoustically different speech sounds. So we're getting a little bit more into the different pitches, different frequencies of the different speech sounds. And this is important for us to know as audiologists because hearing loss typically is different at each frequency, which is, why we test all of the frequencies independently. So knowing where the speech sounds fall frequency-wise can help us in counseling, definitely helps us with hearing aid fitting, and just helps us produce the best outcomes for our patients in terms of audibility and being able to participate in conversations. So this is should be a little bit of a review, just about the different terminology that we use to refer to these different graphs of sound. So the first one is the most simple. It's a temporal waveform. It's in this block A, and this also here in block B is a temporal waveform. All it shows is intensity or amplitude, so volume changes over time. When it's a simple wave like this, you can kind of see that there's two different frequencies. This higher frequency wave kind of combined with this lower frequency wave that come together to produce this type of configuration here. But in the temporal waveform, all you get is amplitude over time. So all you're really looking at here is the loudness changes in the sound over time. The next one is a spectral waveform, which is this one right here with these two lines. And all this one shows you is the different frequency components of a sound, of a complex sound, and their different volumes. So you can see here, this is the spectral waveform of this temporal waveform here. You can see that there's two different frequencies that make it up. That's why there's these two lines, two vertical lines. Those represent the two different frequencies. And you can see that one is about twice as loud as the other one, or has about twice the amount of energy as the other one. And lastly is a spectrogram. That's this one down here. And this one shows frequency and amplitude changes over time. So you can see that this sound down here also is made up of two different frequencies. That's why there's these two horizontal lines. You can see how they change over time. That's this bottom axis here. And the thickness of these bars is the amplitude changes, the loudness changes. So the thicker the bar, the more energy, the louder that component of the sound is. So you have temporal waveform, amplitude over time, spectral waveform, which is frequency and amplitude, and then a whole spectrogram is frequency and amplitude changes over time. And the spectrogram is usually the way that speech signals are conveyed, just because they're very complex and there's a lot of different frequencies and amplitudes that go into them. So a spectrogram is usually gives us the most information when we're talking about speech. So some other terminology to know is fundamental frequency. That's an important one. That is the lowest frequency that is inside of the complex signal. So you can see here in this spectrogram down here that it kind of looks like a sine wave. And it explains down here and in your textbook how to figure out the period, the fundamental frequency of that sound. It's not super important to know the math behind this, but all that is important to know is that the fundamental frequency is the frequency that's actually produced by the vocal cords vibrating. So it's the frequency that your voice naturally produces when your specific vocal cords come together. It's also the lowest frequency component of the signal. And another important thing to note is that the fundamental frequency will be the frequency that all of the vowels are of that speaker. So one person's voice, all of their vowels will have the same fundamental frequency. And it's abbreviated as F sub zero. So sometimes you'll see that denoted somewhere. F sub 0 is the fundamental frequency, the lowest frequency component of the signal. And glottal pulses, I know I mentioned before in the spectrogram, you can see where there's a thickening, like thicker areas of the spectrogram. That's where there's more energy. And these dark bands that you can see in the spectrogram here are representing the glottal pulses, which are when the vocal folds are actually coming together. There's a lot more energy when they actually hit each other. So you see that represented by the thickening of the lines in the spectrogram. Now harmonics. I know that you guys have learned about these before. So when you have a sound and you distort it, which is what we're doing by changing the shape of our vocal tract. So when you distort that sound will distort at its different harmonics. So at different harmonics of the fundamental frequency. And harmonics, just a reminder, are integer multiples of that fundamental frequency. Um, And when a sound is produced, so when you do produce a vowel sound, all of the different harmonics are also produced. But when we change the shape of our vocal tract, some of those frequencies, some of those harmonics resonate louder and with more energy than other ones do. Um, those pitches where there's higher resonance are called formant frequencies. And those are really important when we talk about vowels. So the way that you change the shape of your mouth when you produce a vowel causes distortion of that sound, and it is distorted at these different formant frequencies, where there's extra resonance, and that helps us to understand speech and figure out what vowel is being said. So formant frequencies, you can see in this graph down here, you have the fundamental frequency of this person. I assume they're just saying a vowel sound. Probably explains this graph what they're actually saying in the textbook, but this is the fundamental frequency right here, F sub 0, and then you have F1 and F2. Those are formant frequencies. So you can see here, if you look at this intensity is on this axis here, you can see that F2 and F1 are the other two frequencies where there is a lot of energy. You can see it where there is a lot of volume behind those two, because the way this person's mouth is shaped when they're saying this sound is causing specific resonance at formant 1 and formant 2. So all vowel sounds are characterized by having two prominent formant frequencies, and we can actually recognize any vowel even if all we had was the first two formant frequencies. You could figure out what vowel was being said. So this is also kind of a little bit of a recap. We learn about the resonance properties of a tube that's closed at one end when we talk about our ear canal, because that's a tube that's closed at one end, so it has specific resonant properties. We can also think about the vocal tract as a tube that's closed at one end. When you constrict and close your vocal cords, it causes it creates that closed end of the tube, and then the rest of your vocal tract becomes the rest of that tube. So if you make that tube longer, it lowers the resonant frequency. Lower pitched sounds will resonate with more intensity in a longer tube. And if you make that tube shorter, it raises the resonant frequency. So higher frequency sounds will resonate more strongly in a tube that is shorter. And when we are producing vowels specifically, talking about formant 1 and formant 2, those formant frequencies that help us distinguish vowels, we talk mostly about two different resonant cavities in our vocal tract. So the first resonant cavity is this area from our vocal cords up to the point of constriction of our tongue. So this longer area in the back from the vocal cords to behind the tongue, right up to this point of constriction. That is where the first formant frequency of vowels is resonating. That's where that resonance cavity creates formant 1, the first formant frequency of our vowels. And then secondly, that area right in front of the tongue when we produce vowels creates the second resonant cavity, and that is what creates the second formant frequency of our vowels. So formant 1 is behind the tongue, formant 2 is in front of the tongue. What is also interesting to know is that not only do we hear these subtle formant frequencies in vowels, we can also hear the difference when the vowel is transitioning from a consonant in our mouth. So you can see this bet, det, and get here. All of these have the same vowel and the same last consonant, but you can see in this this spectrogram is kind of telling you the way that formant 1 and formant 2 change. So when we go from a B to that vowel, it kind of raises a little bit in frequency. When we go from a D to that vowel, it stays flat in one formant, and the other formant changes similarly to bet. And then when we do get, that that vowel formant frequency, we can kind of feel it go down in pitch a little bit. So these are really subtle differences, but when we combine a consonant with a vowel, the way our vocal tract is changing shape, going from B, because that's produced in a different manner and place than D. So the fact that our vocal tract is changing shape in a different way when we're going from each consonant to each vowel, that can actually help to give us cues and clues about what consonant was said in front of the vowel. So now this is a little bit of a review from the last lecture. We know that there's all these different characterizations of consonants, and the way we characterize them is their manner of production and also their place in voicing. But specifically for this lecture, the manner is important because that's what really changes the acoustic qualities of the speech a lot, of the consonants. The way in which we produce the sounds in our mouth is what gives them their certain frequency characteristics. So, and you can see all these different characteristics of frequency and intensity when you look at the spectrogram and even when you just listen to speech. But so stops are those short duration sounds with the sudden burst of energy. So you kind of see them as a quick blip on the spectrogram. And fricatives, those are mostly high frequency energy. And they're, like we talked about last time, they're made with that friction in your mouth. They're a little bit noise-like. And the fricatives S and Z are the highest frequency consonants. So those have the highest frequency energy of all the consonants, which is important to know when we start thinking about hearing loss. And then affricates, it's a burst of pretty wideband energy. And then, so you have a burst like a stop, and then that longer duration friction sound, just like a fricative sound. So affricates tend to be typically a little bit higher in frequency as well, but they also have that stop component in the beginning of them, which you could see on the spectrogram. And then we talked a little bit about sonorants last time. Sonorants are those kind of a little bit more vowel-like consonants. They're produced without any friction, really, without much constriction in your mouth, more open vocal tract. But sonorants can be broken down further into either nasals or glides. So the three nasal sounds are and ng. That last one is like an ng. And they're mostly lower frequency sounds. And what's specifically interesting about nasal sounds is when we produce them, the air is coming out of our nasal cavity instead of out of our mouth. Like we talked about last time, if you try to say any one of these nasal sounds while you are pinching your nose, the sound won't come out, and the speech sound can't be produced, because if you're pinching your nose, that air can't come out of your nasal cavity like it wants to when you make that sound. That's why when you're sick and you have a stuffy nose, your voice kind of sounds different. It's because you lose the nasality. And if you look at the spectrogram of a nasal sound, you'll see that there's an area where it's kind of blank, and that is called an anti-resonance. Just like the formant frequencies, the resonant frequencies, you can see a peak, that's a resonance peak. And then if there's an absence of energy there, that's an anti-resonance. And the spectrograms of nasal sounds are pretty characterized by that. And then there's glides, which are also sonorants. They're, like I said, those more kind of sing-songy, almost vowel-like consonants. These are w, l, r, and that J symbol is actually the symbol for y, like the Y sound. And so, just like vowels, we distinguish all these different speech sounds from one another by changes in the formant frequencies when they're being produced. So you have the fundamental frequency of your vocal cords vibrating, and then you change the shape and the constrictions in your mouth that causes distortion and causes the different formant frequencies, different harmonic combinations that give the different speech sounds different sounds. So when we look specifically at the frequency and intensity of vowels, the first formant is typically below 1,000 hertz, so usually pretty low frequency energy. And if you think about that, remember that formant 1 is created from that area from your vocal tract to your tongue, to the point of constriction of your tongue. So it's typically a longer part of the tube, so that gives it a lower frequency resonance. And the second formant frequency is usually below 2,000 hertz, which is still pretty relatively low in frequency if you think about the 250 to 8K hertz that we usually test. 2K is below 2K is still relatively low frequency, but formant 2 is typically higher in frequency than formant 1 because that space in front of our tongue is smaller, is a shorter tube, so the resonance there is going to be at a higher pitch. And another important thing to note about vowels is that all of them are voiced. There are no voiceless vowels, which this means that they typically carry the intensity of speech, the loudness of speech, and they're louder than pretty much all of, if not most of the consonant sounds. Vowels are low pitch and louder. But unfortunately, vowels by themselves are not really helpful when we're trying to understand speech. If you try to read the sentence down here with all the consonants removed, if someone just said that to me, I'm pretty sure I would not know what they were saying without all of the consonants in it. So the vowels are louder, they're easy to distinguish, but they don't give us a lot of the meaning of speech. But consonants, on the other hand, like we were talking about before, just the way that they're produced in your mouth. Some of them are voiceless. They are higher in pitch and they are lower in volume. So these are especially the unvoiced consonants because your vocal cords aren't vibrating. You don't have that energy behind them to really convey that sound very loudly. So consonants are high pitch, low intensity, and they also carry most of the meaning of speech. So this sentence down here is a different sentence, but all the vowels were taken out of it, and you're left with all of the only the consonants. And still a little bit unclear, but you can pretty much make out that it says speech sounds can be consonants or vowels. And you can make that out without any of the vowels there because just proves the point that the consonant sounds are, since they're so different from each other, they convey a lot of the meaning of speech. And this is pretty important for us to understand as audiologists because typically the first area where hearing loss occurs is in those higher frequencies. So consonant sounds are high frequency and they're also quieter. So these type of sounds very susceptible to being missed by people that have classic high frequency hearing loss. So typically leads people to say what this sentence says here, I can hear but not understand. So they can hear the vowels, they can hear that someone's talking to them because those are the low pitched, louder portions of speech where hearing is typically better. But they can't understand because their hearing loss is in that high frequency region where they're missing most of the consonants, which carry the clarity of speech. So that is all about the different frequency characteristics of speech and why it's important for us to understand that while we're helping our patients with hearing loss. So now it's just the review questions. These are just like last time, they're just the ones from the back of the textbook that kind of just make sure you took home the main points from the chapter and get the important terminology and such. So the first few are just definitions, making sure you remember what a temporal waveform is. And temporal waveform, remember, is just intensity over time. So if you just picture like a sine wave, you can see how loud it is and how that loudness changes or doesn't change over time. And then a spectral waveform, remember, gives us that frequency information as well. So it's the one that was just like two lines, because usually there's just a couple of frequencies in it. When we look at a spectral waveform, you can see each frequency distinguished by a different line, and the height of that line tells you how loud each frequency component of that sound is. So spectral waveform is frequency and amplitude. And then a spectrogram, remember, gives us frequency, amplitude, and time. So that's the one we usually look at for speech because it gives us all of those different characteristics that are important for us when we're looking at the different characteristics of speech sounds. And then a glottal pulse, remember, these are those bursts of that thickened black line on the spectrogram, the burst of energy that actually happens when our vocal cords hit each other. And then fundamental frequency, also another one to remember. This is the lowest frequency, remember, lowest frequency of a person's connected speech, and it comes right from that bass vocal cord vibration that's produced. And then all the other speech sounds come from just changing the shape of your mouth, causing those different distortions. But that main carrier frequency of your voice, that lowest frequency component, is the fundamental frequency. And this is just making sure you remember that F sub 0 is the symbol for fundamental frequency. So this is the same thing, lowest frequency in a person's spoken utterance. And then it's also important to remember harmonic frequencies. These are the integer multiples of the fundamental frequency. And each formant frequency, like in vowels, each formant frequency is made up of a few of the harmonics. But it's important to know just what harmonic frequencies are. And then the formant frequencies. The formant frequencies are the certain frequencies where the speech resonates most. So we change the shape of our vocal tract, it creates all those different harmonics. And depending on how we are changing the shape of our vocal tract, certain ones of those harmonics are louder, they become accentuated just because of the shape of our mouth, the shape of where we put our tongue, and the way we shape our lips. Certain harmonic frequencies just get accentuated and they resonate more than others, and those certain ones that resonate more are what create our formant frequencies. True or false? Does vowel detection require a minimum of 3 formant frequency regions in order to identify the vowel? Remember, this is false. It only requires 2 formants. It only requires formant 1 and formant 2 to distinguish that vowel. And is F1 the first formant frequency determined by the size of the area in front of the mouth beyond the major point of constriction of the vocal tract? That is also false. Remember, F1 is the area behind the tongue. F1 is usually that lower pitch region, the larger area that goes from your vocal cord up to that point of constriction of your tongue. And F2 is determined by the area in the front of your mouth beyond that point of constriction of your tongue. True or false, the loss of high frequency hearing primarily decreases vowel recognition. Remember, this is false. Vowel recognition only requires good low frequency hearing because vowels are more low pitched speech sounds, whereas consonant recognition requires that higher frequency hearing. So if you have a loss of high frequency hearing, it will primarily decrease your consonant discrimination because consonants are the higher pitched and also lower intensity components of speech. True or false, in a word that has both consonants and vowels, changes in the vowel fundamental frequency help the listener identify the consonant sound. So this one's a little tricky. It's false because it's not the fundamental frequency that is changing. The fundamental frequency stays the same. Your vocal cords always vibrate the way they vibrate when you put them together to speak. What is changing is the resonance of your voice because of the way you're moving your mouth. So what is changing are the formant frequencies, and that's what helps you identify that consonant or the vowel. And the changes in the formant frequency help you to sometimes identify the consonant that came before that vowel. True or false are stop consonants long duration and noise-like. Remember, this is false. Stop consonants are those ones that are burst-like, short in duration, like p and b. And this question is actually describing fricative consonants. Those are the ones that are longer in duration and more noise-like with that friction in your mouth. Affricates have characteristics of both stop consonants and fricatives. That is true. Remember, affricate is a combination of a stop and a fricative. So it has that burst of energy followed by that longer, more friction-like, noise-like sound. Like the CH sound, it's ch. If you put it together, ch, it's a stop and then a little bit of friction at the end. True or false, the spectrum and spectrogram of a nasal consonant will show a region that lacks energy and anti-resonance frequency. Remember, this is true when we say nasal sounds, the airstream is directed through our nose, and that's a much smaller cavity, and it attenuates a lot of the low frequency components. Remember, if it's smaller, then higher frequencies resonate more there, and that tends to drop a lot of the intensity out of it, and it creates that anti-resonance in the spectrogram. True or false, glide consonants are distinguished from one another by the pattern of frequency changes of the fundamental frequency. This is false. Again, remember, it's not the fundamental frequency that's changing, it is the formant frequencies that are changing. It's those different areas of resonance in our mouth that are changing that help us to distinguish the different speech sounds. So yeah, the fundamental frequency stays the same, but the formant frequencies change based on where we articulate the sound and how we produce that sound in our mouth. People with hearing impairment usually have the greatest difficulty recognizing unvoiced consonant sounds, true or false. This is true. Remember, the unvoiced consonants are the quietest and highest in frequency. So person with hearing impairment, it's typically in the higher pitches. Obviously, there are lots of different configurations of hearing loss, but the most common place where people tend to lose hearing first and the worst is in the higher pitches. So those people with hearing impairment usually have the greatest difficulty with those unvoiced consonant sounds, like the sound S. And this is the textbook that you all have that I use as my reference. And of course, again, if you have any questions or need any clarification, you can always email me. I'm open to any questions.